thank you all for coming. I know, how many of you are just here because it was a cool place to sit? All right. No, it's actually a pretty nice day in the city today. Color workflow can seem kind of like a dry subject, almost kind of a necessary evil. I want to show you that it can be, if not exciting, it can be fairly simple to get under control, and it can be rewarding in a sense that it is going to greatly speed up your whole process. You're going to be much happier with what you're going to get, and you're going to have fun making prints again. And that's the biggest part. How many of you always get perfect prints back whenever you send something out or you send it to your lab? Okay. Guess if you raised your hand, then I'm not sure why you're here. But what we're going to do over these hour and a half or so is go from soup to nuts. We're going to go from capture to edit to output. A couple questions before we get started. First of all, how many of you are Lightroom people? Photoshop, and both, and neither of them. Who's using, what are you using?
Capture.
Capture, like Capture NX? Okay, anybody else? All right, so if you're not using part of the Adobe suite, I mean, Elements applies as well. If you're not using part of the Adobe suite, there's going to be a piece you're not going to be able to take advantage of, and that's custom camera profiles. That is something exclusive to Adobe. Historically, there's been a battle between Adobe and the rest of the world about the whole DNG thing. Adobe wants the world to go DNG, the rest of the world says. So, anyway. Yeah. Oh, yes, and she did say this is being recorded, so if you were here sitting next to someone you're not supposed to be here with, no guarantees. So let's see. How many of you already own one of these? Really? That's it, huh? Okay. This is a ColorChecker passport. This is the same, actually, I always tell people that this is the single best $99 you will ever spend for your photography. I keep one in every camera bag I have, even in non-camera bags. I always have one with me wherever I go. That's why when I first came in and I saw this, I asked Shoshana to check. So we check this price? Because I think it's wrong. Because I happen to know that. I know what dealers pay for these things, and it's much more than they're charging for it today and tomorrow. So if you don't have one of these, do yourself a favor and get one. And what we're going to talk about is obviously color. And I want to talk about it right from capture, right from when you snap the shutter, through the editing process, and then to print. And for printing, it's going to be either your desktop printer or sending out to a lab. For those of you who don't know me, Coloratti seems like a silly word, but I'm one of X-Rite's people. I'm also I'm part of the Sony's Artisans of Imagery program, which for you Canon people is like the Explorers. So, all right, so what are we after? Here's where we're going to cover today. I want you to understand how to get the best color at capture. How many of you are shooting JPEGs? No more JPEGs. And I joke about it, but there's actually a fairly serious reason. It has to do with data distribution in an image. You guys remember Photoshop with the 0 to 255 stuff? Everywhere you looked. Lightroom, they changed it to 0 to 100%. Well, 0 to 255 is 8 bits. That's where the 8-bit color thing. It's 256 steps from light to dark for each channel, red, green, and blue. That means that's all you got in a JPEG. You got 256 steps from light to dark. As you do editing to that image, you're throwing away data. It's compressing things. So by the time you're done, you might end up with 150 steps. And then what ends up happening eventually is, let's imagine you have a landscape with a deep blue sky that goes from deep blue to light blue at the horizon. When you start taking away those steps of gradation, you're going to start to introduce banding, artifacts, all kinds of nasty stuff. If you shoot RAW, how many steps do you have? Well, it depends on your camera, because you have 8 versus 16-bit, but nobody's camera here. Anybody shoot medium format digital? Okay, then nobody here has a camera that's really 16-bit. The high-end cameras, the Canon 5D Mark III, the Nikon 800 series, the Sony A7 series are all 14-bit. And then most other mid-range cameras are 12-bit. What does that mean? Well, it means you've got somewhere between 16 and 32,000 steps instead of 256. So you can do your edits, you can do those adjustments, and then when you send out, it'll get converted to 8-bit. And we'll see that when we get into software. Monitor calibration is probably the single most important thing you can do if you want to get good color wherever you go. And that includes the new machines. My wife and I just put new iMac, 27-inch iMacs in our studio. First thing I did, I was curious. First thing I did right out of the box was I calibrated it to see how off it was. It's substantially off. So consider yourself warned. How many of you, when you send out to your printer or to a lab, you get prints back that are dark? Now, yeah, that's very common. Soft proofing. How many of you are familiar with that concept of soft proofing? Okay, what soft proofing does is it lets you see on the screen what your print's going to look like before you get your print back. Pretty valuable, right? But it's a mystery to most people. And I'll show you in both Lightroom and Photoshop. It's better in Photoshop, but Lightroom's okay. And then, as I mentioned, we'll talk about preparing files, if you're going to send them out to print or if you're going to do it yourself. So what are the pieces we need to make this happen? You need a picture of this thing. And you'll see, I'm going to spend a little time on this because the combination of this and monitor calibration will get you 95% of the way towards getting the color you wanted. I'll talk about monitor profiling. And how many of you do your own printing? Oh, a lot of you, okay. So I'm also going to talk about creating your own printer profiles. How many of you like fine art papers rather than the standard glossy luster kind of stuff? What I've found historically is that luster and glossy stocks, the factory profiles are usually pretty good. The fine art papers for those printers are horrendous. So I'll show you how and when it might be necessary to start to create your own custom printer profiles. By the time you leave today, if you don't have one, you're going to want one. I promise you that. This really is, I don't even consider it an option. So let's start with the ColorChecker. First of all, what is this thing? Here's something that might be a shock. How many of you have more than one camera? And how many of you have different brands mixed together? Anybody have that? Do you notice your camera color response is different? How many of you used to shoot film? Remember that stuff? Remember film? Cameras have their own bias. Isn't it odd that there is no digital standard for what red, green, and blue are? Every manufacturer has their own idea. And when you throw engineers into the mix, forget it. So they're all over the place with their standards or lack of standards. That's what this provides, a set of standards. And let's take a closer look at the actual targets to see what they do. Also, camera sensors work differently depending on what ISO you're putting them at. If you're pushing up to 3200 ISO or some of the new cameras, what this also allows you to do, besides having white balance and having a reference, is allows you to create a custom camera profile so that your camera has a set of standards on which to base its color. And if you actually take a look at it, look at the target. Look, it's got red, green, blue, and CMYK, and then a couple of rows of other stuff. So what the ColorChecker does is it gives you that set of standards so that the camera and the software know how to get to red, green, and blue all the time. Color is somewhat subjective. You're going to want to do your own flavorings. For example, skin tones. This actually has flavorings on the target so that you can make skin tones warmer. Everybody wants warmer skin tones. That's why there's tanning salons all over the place. For landscapes, you might want your blues or your greens to be a little more saturated. That's great. But what this gives you is a perfect starting point, and you're going to see this in action in software. What's really interesting in this is the middle two rows. So let's take a look if you want to use this for the flavoring part. This top row is basically a rainbow. It's really a visual check. It's for you to see that something's wrong. So if you take a picture of this and one of those colors is obviously wrong, chances are you had your white balance set wrong. On the bottom, you've got a gray ramp from white to black. If you're shooting in your camera and you have the blinkies turned on and one of those goes, it's kind of a warning to let you know that you're getting close to clipping. The fun stuff happens in the middle two rows. The top row is designed for portraits, the bottom row is for landscapes. These two targets that are in yellow are actually neutral. They're both neutral. You can use either of them for white balancing. These, let me back up a second, and you can see it even on the screen here and up there. Notice how, as it goes from left to right, do you see them starting to get very slightly bluish, cyanish? What happens if you white balance off of something that is very slightly blue or cyan? Has the opposite effect. It's going to warm the image. So if we know that the opposite of blue is yellow, what's the opposite of cyan? Red. Almost, yes. Red. No, it's red. Opposite of green is magenta. Who said red? Good for you. If you white balance off of that, it has the opposite effect. Now, on the portrait one, I have found the far right one to be kind of garish, but 2 in I do like. So the beauty of that is it allows you to get to exactly the same amount of warmth each time. So those are warming targets if you white balance off of those. See this? You see how that one's going very slightly pinky magenta? That has the opposite effect. So if you're dealing with a landscape and you want to enhance the blues and greens, you can get that. And again, once you do it to one, you can assign it to all the others. And yes, before you ask, if you are using any of the manufacturer's softwares, using DxO, you're using, what else? Capture One, Aperture is gone. Any Aperture users here? Yeah, if you were, sorry. That was inevitable. They do not deal with DNG files. Apple has a history of just finally saying, nah, never mind. Same thing just happened with Final Cut. The video industry has abandoned Final Cut. Everybody's gone to Adobe Premiere or Sony. Thank you. So before we go any further on this whole color journey, your monitor is the one thing that it is so incredibly important that you get it under control. Why? Think about it. It is your window to everything you do. It's where you're making your editing decisions. So if your monitor's wrong, what's going to happen? You're guessing. You've got to get your monitor under control. So I've got 3 devices here. I've got one hooked up. This is the i1 Display Pro. Any of you out there professed geeks? Really into numbers? You know, the whole left brain thing? No? Okay. You probably wouldn't be interested in this one. This is the geeky version, mostly because of the software it uses. It gives you lots of data. If you want to see how your monitor is doing over time, if you want to know how calibrated your monitor is around the edges, it does all that stuff. I'm looking at you, none of you care, so that's fine. You just want to get it under control simply. That's the ColorMonkey display. It's actually a very similar device. What happens is the software they use are different, and this is really, really simple to use. And then this last one over on the right over here, kind of looks like Darth Vader's tape measure. This is a ColorMonkey photo, which finally, late last year, had a nice software update to work with the current OSs very well. This has always been one of my favorite tools. In essence, what happens is the software is going to throw colors up on the screen. These read those colors. And let's say, for example, the software says, all right, show me 100% red. This reads what shows up on the screen. And it looks at it and says, well, let's say, for example, it says, well, I got 97% red and 3% blue. Fine, makes a list of that. What a profile is for camera, for monitor, for printer, is just simply a set of corrections. If I ask for a certain color, what do I have to ask you to do to it to make that color actually show up? That's really all a profile is. There's no mystery to it. So when this reads it and it sees that 3% blue and the red, after it goes through all the colors, it just creates a long list of corrections. So when the computer says on the monitor, please show me 100% red, that command goes through the software, and then the profile says, oh, please take out 3% blue, so we can actually get 100% red. That's really all that's going on. You can see that all these devices, in addition, by the way, to profiling monitors, can also do projectors. Any of you belong to camera clubs, and you have print competitions and stuff like that, well, you need to calibrate the projector, which I attempted to do on this unit before we got here. Actually, I kind of did it, but so if I say I want to do, well, I'll click on the projector. So if I want to click on that, I get this little graphic over here that I have no idea why it's there, but it's pretty. And then there's all this other data. What brightness do you want? What luminance do you want? What kind of technology is on the screen? You don't know. So just go with the defaults. If you have a real reason to change it, you'll know about it. In general, it knows what it's doing. So I click on Next, and then it's going to come up and say, OK, here's the colors we're going to send. By the way, if I had gone in the advanced mode, I would have the choice of sending more color patches up to the screen. This is the small set. There's a medium set and a big set. So now it's basically saying, hang this thing on the screen. So you flip it over so that its little lens can see the screen. It's got a little weight on it that adjusts based on the height of the screen. It just says make sure it's flush. And I really should have brought a mouse. Click on next, and it starts doing its thing. And first it's going to measure brightness and contrast and all that stuff, and then it's going to start throwing colors up at the screen. How often should you do this? How many of you think you have really good monitors? Maybe? Yeah. If you spent over $700, then you might be right. If you spent less than that, you don't. You have an okay monitor. What do you think the weak link is? How many of you, I know a bunch of you guys out there, you've got $3,000 cameras with $1,800 lenses on them, and somebody's got a $179 monitor they got cheap at Sam's Club. What do you think the weak link in that whole chain is? Yeah. Your monitor is a very important tool. If you're doing your own editing, you've got to consider investing in a good monitor. The Rolls-Royce of monitors right now, and has been for some years, are EIZOs, E-I-Z-O. They're expensive, but they have a new range of them that are around $700 that are pretty darn good, yes. Yeah, they're $1,800 to $3,200. Why? Well, think about how are computers used by most people? What are they doing? They're watching YouTube, they're on eBay, they're doing stuff like that. Oh, and occasionally you might do photography, or they're playing games. Well, bright and blue makes movies look good, makes games look good. Not good for photography. So if you've got a monitor that's too blue and you bring an image up on it to edit, well, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to adjust the image on the screen so that it looks good. But what you're really doing is correcting something that was actually okay. But you're correcting for the monitor, not the actual data in the file. And then what ends up happening, when you add yellow to that blue monitor to cancel it out, you end up getting a yellow print. That's bad. I exaggerated it a bit, but you get the idea. If your monitor's too bright, same thing. You'll see your image, say, okay, that's a little too bright, I need to bring it down. So you'll do your levels adjustment or whatever to get it right. Okay, good, that looks much better on the screen, but then you go out to print, and what happens? You get a dark print. Your print comes out too dark. This is the most common thing because almost everybody's monitor is set too bright. You got to get your brightness under control. So now that we know our monitor is correct, now we can go into software and start putting some of the other tools to work. And before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about something that is also a mystery, and it's called rendering intents. You've probably seen this if you've ever gone into soft proofing or you went into color management or color settings in the software. Rendering intents deal with what do I do with color that is out of the gamut of the device I'm going to send it to. And that could be a monitor or a printer. So in this case, that's represented by the colors that are outside the circle. So I've got these yellows and blues that, let's say we're going out to an inkjet printer, and it can't print. On that particular paper, it can't print those colors. They have to move. Well, it can't just leave holes where those colors were. It's got to move them, and how they move is based on the rendering intent. So Perceptual is one of them. So what all rendering intents do is they take colors that are outside of that ability to print and they move them into a printable place. The way Perceptual moves is as it takes those colors that are out of gamut and moves them into gamut, the other colors that were in the way get moved along with them so that the relationship of the previously out of gamut colors and the in gamut colors stays the same. So again, you can see we've got outside, and then as it goes in, everything moves. There's a benefit and a disadvantage to this. The benefit is it's a natural conversion because the relationship between colors stays the same. The downside is you could have 2 pixels out of gamut, and because of where they are, when it moves it in, it completely changes the overall color tone of the entire image. So that's the danger of it. And that's why having a calibrated monitor is important, because you'll actually see it happen. Now, relative colorimetric does exactly the same thing at the starting point. It's going to take those same colors and it's going to move them into a printable place. However, when it does it, it doesn't move any of the other colors. They stay exactly where they were. Again, pros and cons. The advantage is no color shift in the image. The downside is if you've got a lot of color out of gamut, you're going to start to have weird banding issues because you're now changing the relationship between the colors. You've changed their relationship to each other, so now they're not going to be even gradations. So that's really what the two of them do. All right, so I go into Lightroom and I've got a picture here of a color checker. And yes, this is how complicated it is. You take a picture of it. Just make sure that the exposure is correct. Don't clip anything. You don't want to have any of the targets clipping. The white balance is not important because this is a raw file. Now, just to clarify, one of the beauties of Lightroom when you're dealing with raw files is all of the edits you do, everything you do to an image in Lightroom, nothing's actually happening. All it is doing is it's a set of instructions that say when you finally export this file, please do these things to it. When you go under File and Export with Preset, you'll see, after you install the software, ColorChecker Passport. So you click on that, and you give it a name. Well, this was shot with Sony A7R. I'll just call it Sony A7R Demo 1. You can call it Bob. It doesn't matter. The software knows what camera created it. So if you have multiple cameras and you create profiles, when you go to apply it to an image, because of the metadata in the file, the software will give you only the profiles that are applicable to the camera that took the image. So I hit Enter. That's it. That's how complicated it is to create a custom camera profile. And you can see it's up in the upper left-hand corner, it's cooking along. It generally takes 45 seconds or so. How many profiles do you need? Well, once you create a daylight profile for your camera for sunshine, you're done. You don't have to create another one. That's it. White balance, you're going to constantly have to adjust for. But the actual profile itself, no. That's going to be fine. But you need one for shade, cloudy, tungsten light, or when you encounter some kind of really weird mixed lighting situation. And then I'll also show you another time when you're going to want to do it. Some people ask, do I need to do one for different lenses? I have never seen enough of a difference to bother. I've done it. If you like having lots of profiles, you can do that. You may, however, if you like to shoot very high ISO, you probably want to create a profile for that situation. Because as you go very high ISO, you're changing the dynamics of how the sensor works. So Lightroom says it has to be restarted. Am I going to restart it? No, because like I always say, just like any cooking show, I had one in the oven ready. It's already there, so it saves us that step. If you actually look at it, now I mentioned I tried to profile the projector, but it's a little off. But even with your eyes, if you just look up here, can you see how much deeper this blue patch is than what we're seeing on the screens? You see how much lighter this is than reality? What Adobe gives you in both Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw is a profile called the Adobe Standard. For a lot of colors, it's okay, but for some reason on digital cameras, the blues are diminished. They're a little bit lighter. They've lost a little saturation. So I can set my white balance. Let's just go ahead. I can choose any of these. There's white balance. Oh, it was already white balance. Let's say, for example, you screwed up and you had your camera white balance set wrong when you took your picture. By the way, I did not have to white balance before I created the profile because the software is reading the raw data. It knows the values of each of these targets when it finds the target. So, but just for your own sanity, I'll white balance so you can see that. Now let's see what happens to the colors when we apply the profile. And that's under camera calibration. It's exactly the same place in Adobe Camera Raw, which we'll see in a second. So we have this Adobe Standard. So I'm going to click on here. And you can see I've got a bunch of profiles up top. By the way, if your camera has picture styles in it, as many of them do, they will show up. Avoid them like the plague. They're just dreadful. I don't know why you'd want to use them. So here's the Adobe Standard. Well, I created one for the studio. I'm going to click on this. Take a look and watch what happens to the blues, to these kind of purple, plum, magenta, possibly this yellow. Red sometimes, depending on the light, is right on. Sometimes it's way off. Let's see what happens when we apply the profile. Do you see all those colors jump? Does that look closer to what you see here now, even with these monitors? Isn't that blue much closer to where it was? Now it's that same density and saturation that we actually see with our eyes. You are getting robbed of a lot of color. Now we've got perfect color response. That's how easy it is to use a custom camera profile. Now, of course, you don't spend your day photographing targets. You're photographing other stuff. I asked this earlier. How many of you are landscape people? Landscape, scenery, travel, and how many portrait people? Okay. All right. A little bit of a split. So let's do both. And let me zoom in partly. We'll come up in here. I want you to see what happens to skin tones. So here's the Adobe standard. Let's see what happens to skin tones as we apply the profile. Same one we just used. This is studio lighting. Did you see the colors jump? Did you see the green change? Now, what you can do to make it easy is you click on the one that's your target, select all the images in the shoot. So I'll come over here. Oh, let's see. I'll do all these green ones here. I'll come over to here, say, and I just click on synchronize right down here. Click on sync, and I want the white balance from that target. Process version calibration. Click on synchronize, and your color correction editing is done for the entire shoot. That's it. Now you'll then want to go flavor maybe, but basically your color is done. And that's how easy it is to get a studio shoot taken care of. Now, if you're out in the landscape, you're going to handle things a little differently. So let's move over to that. So I'm going to be out in the landscape. You can see the color balance is wrong here. And most of the times I find myself, I just hold it out and take a picture of it. Just make sure it's lit by whatever light, the sun. Now, it's not just the sun. How many of you have been out in the desert Southwest? Monument Valley, Death Valley, stuff like that. Bear of a place to edit your images if you don't have one of these, because something else is going on. Yes, you have daylight, but you also have this entire reflection of that reddish brown earth that is coming up, and it is influencing and polluting all the colors. And you'll do daylight and you'll think, oh, my images are great. Why does everything look wrong? Because that, especially if you got people in the shot or trees or anything else that's not that color, it just all reflects. Let's go again, take a look at the profile under calibration. And let's see. Oh, this was the same camera. Where am I here? I think that's out in Zion. So I click on that and you see the colors jump. In this case, by the way, look at the red target. Not only did the blues jump, but watch that big bright red one in the middle. See what happened? Watch this. See the reds went as well? So we were losing red. Why is that? Because think, any of you do underwater photography? What's the first color you lose when the camera goes underwater? Red. No, it turns blue because the water absorbs red. The same thing's happening here. When you have very moist air, it's absorbing some of the red. The default Adobe profile takes that into account, and when you're out west, you're also losing your reds. If you don't have Lightroom or you're not a Lightroom person, you have the app, which is called ColorChecker Passport. It does exactly the same thing. Now, it does say one thing. It says drag and drop a DNG file here. So this is one time when you would actually have to convert one of your raw files that you took of the ColorChecker into a DNG file. And when we get into Adobe Camera, I'll show you where that is. So I can either drag or I just say, go get one. So I'll add an image. And I have a little folder that I had create DNGs. So if I click on one of these, nope, that's an image. Where's my target? There it is. So I click on open. And what it's going to do is it's going to go look at the image and it's going to look for the target. And when it finds the target, it's going to throw it up on the screen and say, here's the target, is this right? And it'll put little squares around each of the colors so you can check to make sure everything's lined up. And you have a little bit of flexibility moving it around. And then when that's done, you simply click on Create Profile, and exactly the same thing happens. So if you're not a Lightroom person, you do need to do this one extra step of creating a DNG. And so there's the target. The real reason for those things is, let's say, for example, you were holding this out in the sun and one of your fingers was casting a shadow over part of one of the colors. You want to really avoid that, but you do have a little flexibility where you could grab a corner and move it over a little bit like that. So then you click on Create Profile, and exactly the same thing happens that we just saw. Now there is something also in here called a dual illuminant DNG. Just so you know what this is, if you don't want to be bothered with having profiles for different lighting conditions, a dual illuminant allows you to take pictures of the color checker under two very different lighting conditions. So for example, you'd go outside and take a picture of one in the sun, and then you come inside and you take one under fluorescent lights. You then load both of those targets in, and it creates one cut of master profile that will try to adjust as it interpolates through the lights. Is it as good as having a profile for each lighting situation you encounter? No. Is it better than just having one profile for daylight? Yes. But I would say either just create one for daylight and use it for everything, or go all out and create a handful of profiles for the different lighting conditions you'll run into. Chances are, if you have studio lights or speed lights, just create one for each of that. Create one for daylight, create one for cloudy and shade. That's generally all you're going to need, unless you run into something weird. Any of you wedding photographers here? Or event photographers, if you do that when you run into some kind of mixed lighting, where you maybe have fluorescent and daylight, then you might want to do it for there. This is the application that you can manage profiles with. And it goes into your system. It takes a look to see all the camera profiles there, and you can click them on and off. You see those are the ones that are enabled. You can click them and you delete them. You can export them if you have another computer you wanted to load them into and don't want to do it again. Let me just open up a couple of files. And they don't have to be DNGs. So I'm going to mix up. I have some RAWs and DNGs and my target.
What's an ARW?
ARW is a Sony RAW file.
You have to use the DNG profile?
No. See, I'm mixing them up. See, I have ARWs. Those are Sony RAWs. If it was Nikon, it'd be NEF. If it was Canon, it'd be CR2. It doesn't matter. So we've got our profile. Where is it? Even as different as this looks, all the stuff we have here is the development module in Lightroom. It's exactly the same thing. It's just hidden in different places. So if I decide I want to use, I want a white balance, so I white balance off of there. Where are my profiles? See the little camera thing here? There they are. Look, there's our friend, the Adobe Standard. I click on that. This was shot with a Sony a6000. Watch what happens when I apply the profile. See all the colors jump again. We've seen this before. If I want to select the rest of the images in my shoot, I just come over here now on the left-hand side, and I would sync them. So it's the same thing. What I'm finding is most people, if you're on the Creative Cloud, is you do all this organizational basic stuff in Lightroom, and then you send it into Photoshop. And when you do that, Adobe Camera Raw gets bypassed. Why? Because Lightroom's develop module is Adobe Camera Raw. They're the same thing. So it does its Adobe Camera Raw thing, and then it opens in Photoshop. Once you open a file in Photoshop, it's no longer a RAW file. It has then become something else. You still have your RAW file, but it made a copy of it and converted it into Photoshop world. If I click Open Image on this one image, it's just going to go ahead and open it up, and it will then have that profile built into it, because now it is no longer a RAW file. Your black and white shooter, your infrared shooter, this still applies, because not only is it reading the colors, it's reading the tonal density of the chip. So it can also see this thing in black and white. It knows how dense on that curve from white to dark these are as well. So every camera has a contrast curve built into it as well. That might be off, and generally they are also. This will fix that as well. So you can apply a color profile to a black and white image, and it's going to fix the tonal distribution. Because not only is it measuring color, it knows the tonal distribution of every color that's here. So that's a good point. Your monitor is the single most important thing. When you calibrate a monitor, what it's going to do is it's going to make it perform to the best of its ability. There's a little asterisk next to that. Because if you have a $179 monitor, it's not going to look like the $1,700 monitor. All the stuff that goes into making the monitors is important. By the way, don't get hung up on monitor specs. They are the single most worthless set of numbers on the planet. they're worthless. And they all say, oh, this one goes up to 450 candelas. Well, that's great. Anything over 120 is useless. There's no escaping it. With a monitor, you get what you pay for. And if it's a wide gamut monitor, meaning it's showing you Adobe RGB versus sRGB, believe me, they will scream it on the box. If it doesn't say it, it isn't. As lovely as the new Apple iMac screens are, they're still sRGB monitors. Monitors have a life based on how long they're on. And it depends on the technology. LEDs last much longer than the older monitors. Older monitors were good for 5 years or so. LEDs, I don't know. I'm going to guess they're going to last a long time. The bottom line is when you're not using a monitor, turn it off. You know, I have an AZO hooked up to my iMac also. When I'm not using it, there's a little power button right on the front, it gets turned off. Not screensavered, turned off. The electronics are completely turned off. Okay, so we got our monitor under control. Paper profiles. How many of you, a lot of you guys print your own. Yeah. Now, keep in mind that we've got our custom profile, so we know the file is good. We've got our monitor profile, so we know what we're seeing on the screen is good. Now we need to get our prints that look like our screen. Soft proofing. If you're using the, as I mentioned earlier, if you're using the manufacturer's papers, whoops, the glossy and luster stock, the profiles that get installed when you install your printer driver are usually pretty good. The fine art papers, the more extreme the fine art paper, the more off they get. The factory profiles, keep in mind that a factory profile has to be a generic kind of thing. And there's a variation in manufacturing of printers and in the environment. So how do you create a printer profile? It's really simple, but you need, that's where, if you want to get into this, you need a ColorMonkey photo. It's very simple to do. This will do your monitors as well. It will also do projectors. When you ask it to do a printer profile, it's really simple. You just print the targets out. So we're doing exactly the same thing that we did for the camera, where we had our patches from here. The monitor profiling, where the software sent the color patches up to the screen. And for the printer, it just prints them on your paper. We've got color patches to read. This device has a spectrophotometer in it. So you literally, after you print it, you just click on it, you drag it across, let go, shows it up on the screen and says, okay, I got that row next. And you literally do it like this fast. Just drag along. After you've written the first page, it says, okay, I'm calibrating. I will then apply what I've learned from this page to a second set of colors that are a little more darker, skin tone, nature tone oriented. Do the same thing. So again, these are all standard patches. It knows what they're supposed to be, and it creates a profile to correct for that. So what does that look like? Let me show you what happens after you create one. There's a thing called, how many of you are Mac people? Okay. So on the Mac, you have this thing called ColorSync utility. It allows you to look at profiles. How many of you have thought your life would ever lead to this, looking at profiles? So when I'm in the profile, it shows me a list of all the profiles that are in my system, and when my computer eventually catches up to me, bigger. All right, it's not cooperating. There we go. Okay, so here's profiles. So here's factory profiles for an Epson 600. And while I'm in here, you can actually spin it around and see, but really a color profile, you've all seen those like triangular charts. This is what a profile really is. It's actually a three-dimensional thing. So I downloaded Ilford's Fine Art Smooth paper from the factory. And then I printed these targets out on the Epson 600. So let's compare them. I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that the Epson factory profile for this particular paper wasn't too bad. So what you can do is, now a profile by itself doesn't mean anything. That's the colors that this paper can print on this printer. But what I do is I hold it, and then I'll compare it to the one I created, which is right here. And now the factory profile is kind of that ghosted white. The one in color is what the printer can actually print. So you can see I'm actually getting a little bit more deeper color with the custom profile. When you have a custom profile, what it allows the printer to do is to map those colors to the printer more accurately. Remember those rendering intent things, those colors that are out, where's it going to put them? The problem with this particular factory profile is the factory says, I can print colors in here. The reality is the printer can't. So these colors, if they happen to be in your image, are going to be mapped wrong. By having a custom profile, when you do that rendering intent thing, it's going to move them up into the right place. So let's see where that takes place in software, because it's all well theoretically. Let's go into, we'll do it in Lightroom first and then in Photoshop. Let me get you a nice image that we can play with. By the way, how many of you shoot HDR? Anybody? Any HDR shooters out there? Yeah, I think HDR is about on its last legs because the new current batch of cameras are so capable. They have so much tonal range. The three high-end ranges of cameras I mentioned all capture more than 8 stops. And it's very rare you're going to encounter more than 8 stops out in the world. The one exception is you're in a dark room like this and you have a window going outside. That's a special case. But in reality, no. If you capture a really good file, you're kind of done. And just, I'm going to digress 1 second. This is a scene, this is in Grand Teton, and this is a scene where it looked terrible on the back of the camera. But I knew it was a perfect capture because I looked at the histogram, and look at the histogram up here. Do you see anything clipping against the white? No. Do you see anything clipping against the black? What I needed to do, anything digital, you got to protect your highlights. You got to make sure there's detail in there. And if you want to get prints that are going to look like you've got here, you need to know you're capturing the best digital file possible. How much time we got? You want to see a two-minute demo to say how I can turn that into that? Okay. Didn't think it was in it, did you? But this all, when I know I have a monitor that's correct, now I know I can do my edits because my monitor tonal balance is correct, and I know I'm going to get those highlights the way I want. So real quick, let me go up to the basics. Excuse me. Highlights are way up high, so I'm going to bring them down. Good, now I have detail back in my clouds. Shadows way off. Let me bring those way up. Color balance, that's off. I'll just choose daylight for now. Oh, it's looking better already. I'll apply my camera calibration. It's certainly not fill flash. This is, we'll just use a daylight profile. And clarity is a local contrast adjustment. I'll add some clarity, add some vibrance, a little bit of saturation. There, that wasn't even 2 minutes, was it? Remember that thing we were just looking at a second ago? There's the data. That's what I saw when I was standing there. How many of you have been disappointed when you got out and shot, especially a very high contrast scene? Your cameras are good when it's a well-lit scene, it's the middle of the afternoon, they're great at that. However, when you get into a high contrast scene, which are generally the most dramatic, particularly in landscapes, you have to protect those highlights. Once you blow out a highlight, it's gone. Once it hits 255 or in Lightroom 100, there's no bringing it back. You can make it gray, but not with detail. I metered into the clouds.
Question regarding, earlier you were showing your ColorChecker and all that.
Yep.
And adjusting it. But you introduced clarity and all in from Lightroom. How does that affect?
Those are all contrast adjustments, mostly. All we're doing is redistributing the data.
It's not changing.
It's not changing the colors, no.
Colors.
Nope. Yeah.
When you were calibrating against the sheets over there, does it matter what light you're doing it in?
No. That's a good question. The question is, when you're reading these sheets, does it matter where you are? The answer is no, because this thing has its own light source internally that's illuminating. It's a calibrated light source, and it's flush up against the paper. So it doesn't care. Same thing with your monitor. It doesn't care what's going on in the room because the device is flush up against the screen. Good question. So I know that I've got this edited the way I want. How do I know it's going to print this way? And in Lightroom, you've got this little button down there called soft proofing. So what you do is you click on that. And when you do, you'll notice underneath the histogram, now let me get out of my edit thing. Underneath the histogram, you get a new set of stuff. I'm going to create a proof copy, which is just kind of a virtual copy of it. And then it says, look, there's the profile and the rendering intent. So if I'm going to print this on that fine art paper, I've got the one that the factory supplied, and I also have my custom, which I happen to know is more accurate. But where is my custom? Remember it was called Ilford something or other? It's not there. Lightroom only loads in a certain amount of profiles. If you need to go get another one, you need to tell it. So you just say other, and it'll show you all your profiles. And oh, here it is. Does that look familiar? There's the one we just saw when we were comparing in the ColorSync utility. I click OK, and now it shows up in my list. That's just so you don't have to scroll through 100 profiles if you're only really printing on 5 papers. Then I can click on Perceptual versus Relative. And you see how there's a change? As I click on the Perceptual's a little lighter. Now this is where it becomes subjective. This is your own flavoring. Which one do you like? The fact that they're changing, though, that they're different, means there is color out of gamut for this particular paper. Because if there wasn't, when you flipped back and forth to Perceptual Relative, nothing would happen. So which one do you guys like? Let's see, Perceptual, Relative. Any takers? Relative. Interesting. Yeah, all right, I'll go with that. Oh, by the way, this exists both in Photoshop and in Lightroom, the simulate paper and ink thing. You would think after 5 years of having this thing, this button here, that Adobe would get it right. Don't waste your time. It's terrible. Watch what happens. It's saying, oh, that's what the print will look like. That's not what it looks like. I just printed this image at home yesterday. I printed half of this image at home because I ran out of ink. The print looks much closer to what, without turning on that simulation, and it's the same in Photoshop. That button's been there for at least 5 years, and it's worthless, so don't waste your time. It's the same place in Photoshop.
What printer do you use?
I just got the other day an Epson P600, but I got the printer that somebody's loaning me for a time, and 4 of the 9 ink cartridges are empty. So I had enough ink to print those 2 targets and half of a print. So yes, we're trying to get the people from Epson to be nicer to us. Okay, so all right. So you guys decided relative. I was actually leaning towards perceptual, but I'll be democratic about it. If I'm printing myself, I then click on print, and I'm going to have these same questions to answer. There's my print waiting to be printed. And, oh, by the way, just a little Lightroom trick. See, I have to scroll through all this stuff that's all open. Well, if you don't want to do this on a laptop, and this works on any menu, if you hold down Control and click in the menu, you can, oh, why are you not, I'm sorry, this is acting funny. Anyway, you'll get up a little thing, it'll say solo mode. Solo mode only keeps one open at a time. Okay, so let's see, let's go to print job. And here it is again. Except one thing, another thing I would thought Adobe after all these years would have managed. If you make a selection of a profile and you're soft proofing, it doesn't carry over to the print dialog box.
That's a relatively new feature.
It's been there at least for 5 years.
Soft proofing?
Yes. It's been there. Photoshop 5 had soft proofing.
Photoshop, yeah. I like it.
Soft proofing in Lightroom is new. So, but it's the same in Photoshop. So you got to go in and tell it your profile again. You guys voted relative. Fine. Then I click on print. I don't actually have a printer here, but it's going to say preparing print job. And you have to make sure in your print drivers that 2 things are happening. One, that the application is controlling the color, not the printer. Because if you have the printer control the color, it's just going to take everything you just did and throw it out. Are you going to bring me a print dial? Oh, it's going to say, well, you don't have a printer here. Yeah, the printer's offline. All right, the hell with you. The heck? All right, it's going to try to print to my printer, which is home. All right, so it's not going to do it. Just understanding the print dialog box, you got to make sure that the printer is not controlling the color and that you don't have any other color settings, color management in the printer. Epson's notorious for having this thing called Epson RGB as a default. Make sure it's turned off. You just want, you've taken care of the color in the software you've already soft-proofed. So let's do the same thing in Photoshop. Oh, what the heck, we'll use this one. So how do you soft-proof in Photoshop? View, Proof Setup, Custom. And we don't want to simulate CMYK, we want to simulate our printer. In this case, Photoshop gives you everything you've ever used. There's our paper. Now, again, see relative colorimetric, perceptual. See how they're changing? Now, what's very interesting is depending on the paper you choose, you might find that relative looks good for one image and perceptual looks good for another. Or just paper, the same image printed on two different papers, you're going to have a different choice in the rendering intent. That's very common, so you can't just pick one and stay with it. So in this settings, I've got my paper chosen. Let's see, relative colorimetric versus perceptual. See those other two? Saturation and absolute, ignore they're there. I wish Adobe would just take them out or make them a special feature because none of you are ever going to have reason to do those. So let's see what perceptual does. Any votes this time?
Yeah.
All right, let's hear it.
It's me.
Yeah?
Perceptual.
Perceptual, anybody else?
Let's see it again.
Relative. Oh, we got to split. We got the blue side of the room and the red side of the room over here. All right. Yeah, it's really subjective. These other buttons, preserve RGB numbers. Another button should be taken away. Only bad things will happen. Don't ever click it. Black point compensation should be turned on as a default. Leave it alone. These silly things are what we just saw in Lightroom. Same exact thing happens. Oh, simulate paper color. Well, no. That's not what the print's going to look like. It makes it all washed out. It's worthless. You would think Adobe, with all of their power and programming finesse, would know how to do this. But there's certain things they have really weird holes. For example, HDR. Have any of you ever tried doing HDR stuff in the Adobe programs? It's dreadful. Lightroom just added it, and Adobe Camera Raw just added it. If you've tried it, it's awful. Compared to what Nick's HDR Effects Pro does, it's pathetic. So there's certain things they're just not good at. So this whole display options thing, don't waste your time. So fine, we got perceptual, same thing I got to print. That, we're looking at the proof setup, the image under proof colors. If you go to view, see how proof colors is checked? You are now looking at the image through the profile for the paper. This is showing you this is what the print's gonna look like. That's the beauty of it. If you have a calibrated monitor, you've got your image the way you want, you've got the proof setup chosen, you've got your profile and the rendering intent, that's what you get. So I've got my image. Everything's good. I printed on my desktop printer, but I also want a big giant print from the lab. Fine. I need to do one other thing. I need to go to Edit, Convert to Profile. What profile do I want to convert it to? Not the paper, because my lab isn't printing on my paper. Now I have to send it to sRGB. If I'm going out to my lab, I need to set my destination space as sRGB, right there. Hit OK. Oh, again, I have perceptual versus relative. Let's take a look. Any difference? Very subtle. Pretty much nothing. Which means that in sRGB's color space, there aren't really colors in this particular image that are beyond. Now, people poo-poo sRGB. Oh, ProPhoto RGB is bigger. Yeah, it is. How many of you have been upset with the amount of colors that your lab's getting you? Lab printers for forever have been sRGB printers. They're all sRGB. The only way you get more of that is when you go out to a big inkjet. They're closer to ProPhoto RGB. Other caveat is your monitors, most of you are looking at sRGB monitors. So if you're dealing in ProPhoto, you can't see those colors anyway. They're there, but you can't deal with them. That's subject for another day. So I hit OK. I then save this as a full res JPEG. So I would do a save as. I typically, when I'm getting ready for a print job, I create a folder called to print that I'll usually put on my desktop, which there it is. And I will save this as a JPEG. Notice in my embed color profile, it says sRGB. They can really get rid of the rest of the numbers. They don't do anything anymore. Click on save. I want full quality. I send that file to the lab. That's what I get back. I do this all the time with all my labs. There's a handful of labs that I use for different kinds of things. I follow this procedure. Very rarely I'll get something that's off, but I know it wasn't me. And I'll call up the lab and say, you did something wrong. I had this happen with a lab who I won't mention their name, other than it ends in illers. I sent them competition prints to be printed. They came back. They were awful. So I got on the phone. I said, what'd you do to my files? They said, oh, you were a new customer. We upgraded you to our ambassador service, and our people did color editing and adjustments for you. And I said, that's really nice. Do you know what I do for a living? So I said, and I wrote in big letters on the order, do not touch the files. So they had to reprint them again and FedEx them to me. But in general, I deal with ACI, White House, H&H, Bay Photo, Nations Photo Lab, Canvas On Demand, and another place called CG Pro Prints. Any of you have photography businesses with a website to go along with it? If you have those two things, look up CG Pro Prints. That's where you want to go for canvases. Stupid cheap. I don't know how they do it. CG Pro Prints. CG, yes. I don't know how they do it. I had canvases done, 20 by 60 inch canvases framed, and I want to say it was like 90-something bucks. It was ridiculous. But you have to be a business. You have to be a photography business. So you have to have a website and a resale number.
You're doing your printing from Lightroom.
Uh-huh. Oh, good point. Let's do that same last thing. Forgot about that. I want to take this and I want to send this image to the lab. So I go back to my develop module, not through the print module. Lightroom doesn't do color management until you export. Lightroom is always working in ProPhoto RGB behind the scenes. You don't have any control over it. But when I go to export, I would then prepare my files for going out to the lab. So for example, I choose where I want to put them. Same thing, I'm just going to put them in my to print folder. I'll choose that. And I want a JPEG and sRGB. I had already assigned my, through my proof setup, remember we did that proof print? I've already got my rendering intent chosen. But right in here is where I choose my color space. And there it is, sRGB. And I click on export, and now that file is ready for printing. So in Lightroom, you do it in the export module. In Photoshop, you save as.
Do you have any size problems getting your files over email-wise?
Nah. No. I routinely send 400 or 500 megabyte files. No problem. We're getting close to out of time. So let me finish up because I want to finish one more thing with you. And by the way, when we're done, anybody has any questions, I'll hang around. So let's summarize. We've seen soft proofing now. So let's summarize what it does. Basically, it shows you what your prints are going to look like before you print them. Keeping in mind that you're looking at something on a monitor versus paper. So paper is always going to be the worst thing you can look at because you're looking at it under reflected light, CMYK inks on paper. But once you start to do it a couple of times, you'll learn kind of in your mind, when I get it to look this good on a monitor, I know it's going to look this good on paper. You have a question, sir? No? Okay. And for a lab, unless they're printing on something special like a big inkjet printer, send them that calibrated sRGB file, and you're going to routinely get prints back that look like you see. If they're printing on something special, some labs will offer you their profiles. There's a lab we deal with, ACI, where sometimes we have metal prints done, particularly for school sports stuff. They have a profile. We just download their profile, we soft proof with their profile, adjust to it, but we still send them an sRGB file. Because if I send them that profile built into it, their printer would add the profile again, and it would call what's called a double profile, which is not good. So always send your lab that calibrated sRGB file. I don't know if color workflow will ever be exciting, but it will save you so many hours of frustration sitting in front of the computer trying to get your images right. Because when you have the color, you have a color checker, you've got your monitor profiled, and you've got your paper profiles, follow those things and you're going to get very good results all the time. Little sidebar, I was hiking in Zion. I just finished a photo workshop, and I had this out in front of me. I'm taking a picture with it, and this guy walks by me, and he says, "What is that?" I said, "It's a ColorChecker passport." "What does it do?" I explained real quickly. I said, "You know, it's a set of standards, so I know my color is going to be perfect every time." He said, "Oh my God, that might help me." I said, "Why?" He said, "I had to switch over to black and white a couple years ago because I became colorblind severely. So we stopped doing color photography." He actually ended up buying one. He sent me an email a couple weeks ago. He said, "I'm back to printing color now. Thank you." So because he was able to just ignore any color adjustments, he just relied on this, and he was doing color printing again. So that will take your thought process out of it if you want. I wouldn't want you to add something to your kit if I didn't think it was worthwhile. I'm sure, like me, you all have a box of photographic detritus that you've collected over the years because we photographers have a tendency to be gear hounds. And my ex-wife was a speed bump to me buying gear. Ex-wife was a speed bump to me buying gear. I think it's better. My current wife is a photographer. She runs our studio. Now I have another problem because my wife is a gear hound. She's a techie. And when I see something cool, "Oh, that's cool, buy it." Or, "I want one too, buy 2 of those." So it's nice that I get to have all the toys I want. It's bad that neither of us are providing any speed bumps to the bank account. When DJI announced the new Phantom 3, how many of you guys have seen any of my videos online? I do a lot of filming. I want to add a little pizzazz to it. So I want to get some aerial filming where I can walk around, I'll talk into my mic and record locally, but I want to get the cool things that aerial photography or video will let me do. So Phantom just announced the Phantom 3 standard, shipping next week. They have it here, but it's not quite there yet. Where it'll actually follow you. So I can just have my phone in my pocket, and the Phantom will follow me wherever I go, so I can record myself and not have to have another videographer. So just as a little inspiration, we've got all our stuff done. We've got our great prints. The other thing that I do is I teach workshops around the country and around the world next year, teaching landscape, because that's really what I love. As much as I love the city, I find that when I get out into the country, get in my rental car, I head up to Utah, 3 hours I'm in Zion National Park, and I notice this is what happens. My shoulders drop, my breathing slows. I say, "Oh, finally." So the beauty is that when I go out to shoot, I know that I'm going to get on my final prints what I was after.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.